on the way to the ER, I'm up to 103. A few minutes later, I'm up to 103.5. A few minutes later, check again, just my temperature just keeps going up. So they rush me back, all these tests. What's up, guys? So today we have a little bit of a story time, a tale about my worst diet to date. So I've dieted many times over the years, bulked up, cut down, and lately I had recently bulked up to 210 pounds. That is not the heaviest I've been, but one of the nice things about it was that despite being 7 pounds lighter than my previous high, my arms were the same size as when I was previously 217, and strength was basically the same across the board. So I had achieved that same level of muscularity, potentially maybe a little bit more since there was less body fat, and obviously body fat will impact measurements, and I achieved that 7 pounds less. So I was very happy with that, and I have to say, even in clothes and whatnot, I felt like I was holding it better. So even though I often discuss how a lot of progress is often not gonna be made when you're 15, 20 years into this, it doesn't mean that no changes can be made. And it did seem like some minor progress had occurred. Now keep in mind that 217 was about 7 years ago. And it's not like I actually gained 7 pounds of muscle or anything like that. If I had continued to bulk up to 217, I do think I would be a little stronger. I do think I would be a little bit bigger. It would mostly be fat gain though. And so maybe it would have been a net of 1 or 2 pounds of muscle in that 7 years. I'll take it, happy to see any progress, but I just want to keep things in perspective. And so at this point, I decided I want to maintain a leaner physique. You might have seen me talk about this with my recent podcast with Alex Leonidas, among podcasts with others. And basically, I just decided that the force feeding, at this point, I don't have the same appetite that I used to have. And it actually is hard for me to be 210 or even above at this point. My appetite in general is not as high, and just my desire to be that heavy and at a higher body fat is not as high. There are some great things about it. I like being strong. I like filling out the clothes more. And it is nice to get compliments from people who maybe haven't seen you in a while, or in my case, patients or other people I see, and they think you've made a lot of progress when, of course, a lot of it might be body fat. But it is nice to feel bigger and like you lift. But again, at this point in my life, I don't know if that's really something that I want to be pushing. And I also don't believe that you necessarily have to be the heaviest you've ever been to make progress. I often talk about how you do want to have a sufficient surplus, and I don't think that you can just maintain your way to your ideal physique, but that doesn't mean you necessarily have to push to higher and higher body fats or weights all of the time. And so I basically decided, you know what, I'm going to cut down to at least 190, maybe even 180, see how I like it, and maybe even try some other things to keep me motivated. Maybe get into some calisthenics, maybe get into something else that I'm going to enjoy, but it's still going to allow me to progress. So I decided, okay, I'm going to do a slow cut and see how things go. Additionally, you may have seen me talk on the podcast with Alex Leonidas about doing this low saturated fat experiment. So for those who don't know, LDL is generally seen as a negative marker of health, right? When you get a lipid profile done, there's generally HDL, total cholesterol, triglycerides, sometimes non-HDL, and then LDL. Generally speaking, most people agree you would like LDL to be lower than where it was for me, which was sometimes 110, sometimes up to 130. I had even had a couple that showed 140 or so. And so I wanted to see, before I start considering anything like maybe a statin or ezetimibe or anything like that, should I just try something, or could I do something to bring it down through diet? Now, there's a large genetic component when it comes to lipid levels, right? We've had Brian Borstein on the podcast many times. He's talked about, despite whatever he eats, his LDL stays usually at 70 or below, whereas other people might have naturally much higher levels. Certainly, if you look at my experiments and others who have done ketogenic diets and carnivore diets, LDL can skyrocket, whereas you might have other people who are on a vegan diet, for example, and are eating very high fiber and low saturated fat, and their LDL cholesterol will be quite low. So I just wanted to see what would happen. I've done many experiments over the years, but I have not done that. So I'm bringing my saturated fat, I might make a whole video on this, but basically bringing it down to 15 grams or so per day compared to where it was at before, which was 30 to 60 grams per day as I was gaining weight. So 1 week after beginning this diet, I noticed that my throat was a little bit sore. I don't really get sick very often, and so most of the time if I do, I'll just go to sleep early, I'll kind of sweat it out, and by the next day I'm fine. But I didn't feel fine. In fact, the next day I felt worse. So obviously I'm interacting with patients all the time. I don't want to get employees or patients sick. So I took 1 day off and I just decided not to go in that day, figured I would rest. And as expected, I slowly started to get better. I did have a fever, but it was minor, around 100.5. By that Sunday, I was feeling significantly better. We went out, didn't have much of an issue. I figured I just have a residual cough. So this is where things really took a turn for the worst. So after I had those negative tests, I went back to work, and all of a sudden I'm really not feeling well. I'm getting hot and I started to sweat. So I go upstairs, my team is telling me that I'm not looking good, and I check my resting heart rate on my watch. Normally, my resting heart rate is maybe even in the 40s, usually not higher than in the 50s. If I'm walking around a lot, maybe in the 60s. So I check, and it is in the 90s, 96, 98. I'm thinking, what is going on? That never happens to me. And I check my temperature. It's 101.5 at this point. So I'm like, all right, that's not typical for me at all. So I go to the ER. Now, is that something that I would typically say you need to go to the ER for? No, but at this point I've already been to urgent care. They told me nothing was wrong, so I go to ER. By the time I get to the ER, my resting heart rate is now 122. So one of my employees drove me there, and the ER, they hooked me up, EKG, all that fun stuff. Turns out I had flu and strep. So I don't know what tests this urgent care was doing, but they were obviously not adequate. So I have flu and strep, both for the first time in my life. I've never had COVID, I've never had the flu, I've never had strep. So obviously I'm feeling horrible. I take the rest of the week off. I have never in my life had more than a week off of lifting. Literally since I started seriously lifting at 14, I have never taken more than a week off. I just haven't had the desire to. Even when I had a major surgery in high school, they told me not to even lift for a month. But a week or so later, I was doing calf raises on the stairs and just doing some light exercises. So I just usually don't like to do it. So I figure, okay, I need to rest. I need to recover. People get flu, people get strep, usually not at the same time, but it is what it is. So they give me antibiotics, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to take a week off. We'll see what happens. Well, of course, I then don't have much of an appetite. So I have the easiest cut ever because I can't eat. But of course, this is not how I want to lose the weight. So I don't work out. 2 days later, I wake up, despite the fact I'm on antibiotics and Tylenol and whatnot, I wake up and now my fever is 102. I check it again. Okay, this is not a good sign. So I go back to the ER. On the way to the ER, I'm up to 103. A few minutes later, I'm up to 103.5. A few minutes later, check again. Just my temperature just keeps going up. So they rush me back, all these tests. They don't see anything else going on. They just see, again, the flu, the strep, still negative for COVID, but just rapidly rising temperatures. So we had to get everything stable before I could go home. Again, I'm not somebody who goes to the doctor that much. I don't really ever go to the ER. So this was definitely a new experience for me. They recommend I take a while off. So I had to miss a ton of work, but I'm also now not working out for 2 weeks. The antibiotics that they prescribe for the strep caused significant GI issues. I had a lot of chronic pain going on at this time. It was a whole mess. So now I'm 2 weeks off from lifting and I want to get started. But despite the fact that those 2 other issues were finally getting resolved, I seem to get a stomach bug. So at this point, my average calorie intake, and this is with force feeding. I am force feeding calories at this point because I do not want to. I of course want the nutrients, but I just don't want to lose all this weight. So I dropped from 210 to an average, not just like a one time, but an average of about 201. That was about 2 weeks. So of course I want to lose weight if I'm dieting, but that's not how you want to do it while you're sick and not lifting. But I'm force feeding food, I'm getting whatever I can in. And of course, during this time, I am doing the low saturated fat experiment. Now I had some people ask, well, why didn't you stop the experiment? Well, for one, I'm usually very dedicated to the experiments I do. I want to be consistent with them. But 2, I never would have dreamed that this illness would have turned into a 3-week disaster. If I had known up front, this is what's about to happen, then yes, I probably would have dropped the experiment and just said, you know what, I'll do it when I'm better because I need to find a way to get the calories in so I'm not just shedding all of this weight. But I didn't know. I figured it was going to be a couple days, then maybe 1 week. That turned into 3 weeks. So my average calorie intake while maintaining this with this food was about 1,800 to 2,000. I lost 9 pounds. I probably shouldn't have taken any measurements, but just out of my own curiosity and documentation, I did. I lost between 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch off my arms. Now, obviously, I'm not saying I just dropped a ton of muscle that quickly, but I clearly did lose some muscle. Almost 3/4 of an inch off your arms in 3 weeks is dramatic. And when I got back to working out, substantial drops in pretty much everything. Just a side tangent here, I think I brought this up with a recent podcast with Kasim and GVS, is that one of the things I always talk about, these neurological adaptations. I have recently implemented a low cable row, and that's because it's only a few weeks in, something that I'm getting better at week to week. So when I came back after these 3 weeks off, I was actually stronger on this exercise within 1 or 2 sessions compared to pull-ups, which I've been doing for 2 decades. We're down 5 reps from my max. So even though both back exercises, it really does show you that the exercises that are new can keep adapting and you can get better at them neurologically, whereas those that are more representative of true strength, obviously in this case, dropped off a ton. Now, will I get that back? Will I get the strength back and will I get the size back? I'm actually not so sure. The reason being, it was such a dramatic drop in such a short period of time. And frankly, I still don't have a full appetite back. I have no desire to go back up to 210 and try again. I am basically doing what I can to maintain 201 for the time being. And hopefully, because I was there before, I can more or less recomp, because I'll tell you, I don't look much leaner. I was actually shocking seeing myself in the mirror during this time, having not worked out for 3 weeks and all of that, how much worse I looked. There were times when I was 208 to 210, where again, I remember thinking, wow, I'm holding this pretty well relative to times in the past. Whereas this 201, you see yourself, and of course, again, this is gonna be somewhat temporary. I'm gonna be looking better when I have a pump. I'm gonna get some of this back. But just the stark difference in appearance was really something to see. So I do expect to get most of that strength back. I do expect to get most of that size back. But if I do not then return to any sort of surplus, will I get all of it back? I'm not sure, because again, that was more or less a peak for me. So we're not talking about just getting most of it back, like when somebody had lifted for years and then they kind of become a couch potato and then they get back to it. We're talking for what was for me a peak. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to maintain this weight for the next few weeks at least to try to get some strength and size back, and we'll see. And the goal will still be to get down to that 185 and just be a leaner individual. Unfortunately, it probably won't look like I lift as much in clothes, but that's okay with me because I do want to focus more on some other things, health as well as maybe just being more athletic. I think that will be a fun thing for me to do to keep things interesting for the time being, and we'll see what the future holds. But anyway, guys, I just wanted to share this story. It was a very interesting 3 weeks for me, feeling much, much better. Still a little bit of a scratchy voice, still a lingering cough that might linger for a few more weeks, but I'm at about 90%. And I'll tell you that when you're at about 50% of your normal capacity, 90% feels amazing and you can really appreciate it. So hopefully we get back to regular videos and podcasts. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, a little bit of story time here, and I will see you next time.